Yes, it's another 10th episode time in my nostalgia trip games, this one being for the Sinclair ZX Spectrum. To comply with the previous nostalgia trip that was the 10th Commodore 64 episode, I had to dig up a similar amount of relatively early games for the Spectrum for its 10th episode. Because the Spec doesn't have quite as many in-house games from the launch year, nor indeed as many in-house games that I even played, I have included all the Sinclair released games that I have actually played, not counting Eric and the Floaters, which is part of the Bomberman saga, and it will be mentioned elsewhere. Nor counting Montezuma's Revenge, aka Panama Joe, because it was already mentioned in the Atari 8-bit episodes. Nor counting Match Point, because I first played it on the Commodore 64. So we start with a text adventure that still continues to baffle me with its uncooperative parser and lack of helpful descriptions to get you even properly started. Adventure A, Planet of Death, was originally published by Arctic Computing Limited for the ZX81 in 1981, but from what I can tell, the ZX Spectrum version doesn't seem to upgrade anything more than the cover art and make the program code more compatible with the ZX Spectrum. Feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. The setting here is that you have been stranded on an alien planet and you need to find your way out of there. Of course, getting lost in an almost undecipherable maze after taking 2 steps in the game is only to be expected from a 1981 game, but if you manage to avoid the maze, the game can become interesting even. Being one of the first games I ever played on a computer, Planet of Death managed to put me off text adventures for quite a long while, thanks to me having no skills in English at the time, and no matter what I tried to do, I would only get, "I don't understand, tell me what to do." As you see, things haven't really progressed for me when it comes to this game. Too bad the most interesting thing about the Sinclair re-release of Planet of Death is the Tony Roberts cover art, which was later used by the 1992 Commodore Amiga game Agony by Psygnosis. A collaborative effort by Scion Software and Microgen, we have a rather nice version of chess, which I remember wasting a few hours with in my early Spectruming days. Not because we didn't have an actual chessboard, we did, but because I liked to see how the computer decided to move its pieces. As is only natural, this version of chess is played on the keyboard, using a given range of keys. You can see the appropriate keys on the screen, but you do need the cover leaflet for full instructions. From the less action-based Sinclair research games, this was definitely one of my more frequented ones, and it's still surprisingly enjoyable. And the cover is also nice. Next up we have Reversi, for which even the cover art says with small print that the game is otherwise known as Othello. Well, thanks for clearing that up, but when I first played this game I didn't even know Othello. As it turned out, the game is something like Gomoku, the 5-in-a-row version of tic-tac-toe, but in Reversi, or Othello, the aim is to eat up your opponent's pieces by placing them opposite one of your own pieces after a row of your opponent's pieces. The winner is whoever has more pieces on the board. Clearly, another board game that works best when played against a human opponent on an actual board, but less cumbersome in digital mode. On a side note, I was always confused about what the MOI meant in the in-game title because moi in Finnish is a kind of casual greeting. Apparently, moi was a company called Mine of Information Limited, whose only game developing effort was Reversi. Well, at least their single game product is one that people remember, so that's something. Another Scion title from the bundled bunch of games I originally had for the Spectrum is yet another board game translation, this one being Backgammon. This, I admit, was a game that I never really understood properly back in the day because of the English instructions and because this was not really a game that anyone in my acquaintance knew how to play to explain the proceedings. Well, the idea, as far as I can now tell, is to get your pieces from one side of the board to the other before your opponent manages to do it. What I can't understand is, I remember loading this game up many times to attempt to understand the game, which I never did, so why did I keep going back to it? Perhaps the reason was to make myself remember it as some sort of unfinished business. Maybe that's enough reason to make it nostalgic. Scion must have made the most games and other programs for Sinclair Research, since we still have a few games to go. The next two were released on the same tape, although this first one, Planetoids, was also released as a standalone game cartridge. Planetoids is basically a clone of Atari's Asteroids, but instead of wireframe graphics, we have some actual color here. This was my first exposure to this specific genre, and while it's not quite as fine-tuned as the original Asteroids, it's not a bad clone. Thanks to its more colorful graphics, and probably even the Scion loading screen, I kind of prefer this one over the original. The B-side game is called Missile, and it was only ever released as such. This one puts you in control of a twin laser gun from first-person perspective, and you need to destroy ballistic missiles that are coming at you. You can move the camera around, zoom in and out, and fire when ready. The info display part of the screen shows a compass and your condition, so there's enough stuff there to get you easily settled. It's admittedly a bit boring, but successfully destroying a missile for the first time is kinda nice. And then we have Space Raiders, which is probably my favorite Space Invaders clone of all time, even surpassing Invade a Load on the C64 Mastertronic tapes. My reason for liking this one so much is the funky designs of the aliens and your spaceship. There are also a few simple but effective visual effects, and the sound effects are more crisp and clear, well-designed beeper stuff, than the muddy booming noises of the original arcade gameplays. Small changes, but enough to make the game more interesting. And yet, it plays well too. As I've already mentioned all the other Sinclair Research published games that I used to play in the early days in earlier Spectrum episodes, I shall have to include a couple of games that were more recent findings instead. One of them is a Hudson Soft game called Driller Tanks from 1983, which is a peculiar item because in addition to the Spectrum version, it was only ever released on Japanese computers along with the MSX standard computers. Even more oddly, Hudson also released the game on the ZX Spectrum with its original Japanese title, Itasundorios, which features different colors. Driller Tanks is fairly reminiscent of Dig Dug in that the game is played underground and you need to destroy all the fire-breathing monsters by shooting your ice cannon at them, and then pushing them to break them into piles of ice dust. Before you do that though, you need to make room for the ice by drilling the ground. Unlike Dig Dug, the underground area is a maze of impassable walls, so there's an element of Pac-Man included, if you want to think of it that way. It's a fun game, very much worth checking out, and likely of interest to anyone who likes Stop the Express, the author of Fumihiko Itakagi's first international hit game. A rare example of edutainment on the ZX Spectrum that I have played a few times is Scion's Estimator Racer from 1984, which I didn't learn about until about 20 years ago. The purpose of the game is to practice your mathematical estimating skills in a rapidly progressing environment by putting you to drive a race car on 4 lanes. So to work on that logic, you are given mathematical problems to which you must choose the answer closest to the truth by selecting the lane your answer is on. The game has 4 speed modes and 6 mathematical missions to choose from, and there are, rather surprisingly, a few different road conditions as well. Estimator Racer isn't exactly one of the most exciting games in the Sinclair Research catalog, but for an edutainment game, It's good enough. There aren't too many pinball games on the Specky, so when I found out some 10 years ago that Sinclair Research had released a game called Zipper Flipper in 1983, I immediately decided that this game must be fantastic, because it was a Sinclair Research release that I had never heard of. Never mind the fact that it was released as Pro Pinball earlier that year by R.E.D. Sunshine. Zipper Flipper sounded epic, so it automatically was. Well, to be brutally honest, it's not the most playable of pinball games, largely thanks to its odd flipper mechanisms that go both ways. The table itself isn't particularly playable either, but there is a bit of breakout-like action on the side of it, which is an interesting feature. Zipper Flipper is not, nor was it ever, a particularly well-received game, but its obscurity, its weirdness, and its silly re-release title make it a winner in my book, all good reasons for having bought it into my collection. Mind you, the game is still on its way to its destination while I'm recording this. After all that Sinclair cheapness, it's time we drift off to some third-party releases for most of the second half of this episode. One of Durell Software's earliest and biggest hit games was Harrier Attack from 1983, originally released for the Auric and Spectrum and later for the C64 and Amstrad. Even an Atari version was being made and a prototype of it has survived. I'm probably going to do a comparison of this one later this year when I have the time. Basically, it's a slightly more complex version of Scrabble, but the idea of Harrier Attack is based on the Falklands War, where the Sea Harrier fighter had an important part. The game starts off from an aircraft carrier ship, and you fly to the right and shoot and bomb the heck out of everything you can. There's really not much more to it, but having no lives to spare gives the game a different kind of a challenge. Also, since you have a finite amount of not only bombs or rockets, but fuel as well, there's real pressure to make your shots worth the effort. For a side-scrolling fighter jet game from 1983, it's quite advanced, and does defend its place in any Spectrum game collection valiantly. Now here's a game that I actually played more on the C64, but I do recognize it plays a bit better on the Spectrum. After all, Skool Daze was originally made for the Specky, and that's where it ultimately belongs. Skool Daze puts you into the shoes and the school uniform of Eric, an attendee of an all-boys school somewhere in Britain. While the game plays in a rather sandbox manner, making Skool Daze a pioneer in the style of gaming, there's an actual plot to it. Your mission is to steal your report card from the staff room while no one is attending. Of course, this means you have to make all the other pupils and teachers busy and keep them far away from you. There are 4 teachers to keep an eye on, as well as 3 specific pupils, one of which is the obligatory bully. The problem is, it's a time-consuming process, as you have to attend all the classes and try not to get into trouble, inadvertently or otherwise. And even when you do figure out what sorts of things you are able to do to make progress, some of the objectives are so finicky and time-sensitive to perform that completing the game can become a chore rather than pleasure. But then, whoever said school was easy? Anyway, Skool Daze is a classic for good reasons, and I do recommend it, if a bit cautiously. Despite Ocean Software being one of the most prolific and highly regarded software houses since 1983, their Spectrum catalog was left largely unknown to me, thanks to my sadly limited access during my initial period of time with the Spectrum. One of the few Ocean games that I did get to play, although not extensively, was Moon Alert from 1984. It's not exactly a game I revisit too often because I still don't have it in my collection, but just by seeing screenshots of the game online, it always takes me back to 1985, 86, when I played it a few times, without much success as I recall. The main difference to Irem's more classic Moon Patrol is that the terrain features many levels, so you need to jump around just because your moon buggy cannot bend to the will of the terrain. Otherwise, the action is rather similarly straightforward as in Moon Patrol, just shoot anything that you cannot jump over. It's not a bad game as such, rather a nice alternative to the original, in fact, but it does get overshadowed by Ocean's other hit games, as well as the more traditional Moon Patrol clones. But I suspect it's because this was a Spectrum exclusive. Next up we have a peculiar shoot-'em-up game which takes place inside the pyramid. This 1983 classic from Fantasy Software puts you in control of a weird-looking hovercraft device which can shoot a short-range laser beam. You start your journey through the pyramid from the top and you must plow your way all the way down the pyramid's 15 levels in any chosen route. Each room gives you the choice of taking a left or right exit down, and each room has a different set of enemies to deal with. Unfortunately, your way down is blocked by barriers which can be broken through by dropping blue diamonds on them. The way to get diamonds is you need to shoot a number of enemies to reach a quota, which drops a white diamond from the ceiling, and then you need to wait until it turns blue before you can pick it up, then deliver it to the barrier of your choice. As an arcade-like game concept, the pyramid is a solid one, and could have made well as an actual arcade game with more advanced presentation. Granted, it does tend to get a bit repetitive after a few levels, but there is also a difficulty progression that keeps you interested. Definitely one of the better games from 1983. If Harrier Attack took Scrabble to a more realistic environment, Melbourne House's 1982 variation Penetrator took the original idea and turned it into a wildly Spectrum-flavored frantic beast. Penetrator starts with quite possibly the most impressive title sequence in any Spectrum game up to that point, with a brief display of fireworks and then the game title being written in large handwritten style letters, which still manages to bring a smile to my face. The main game itself is nothing particularly special, but the differently colored levels give Penetrator its own particular look. Whether it's all done in good taste is a matter of opinion, of course, but for me, it's more nostalgic than any proper Scrabble clone, similar to Harrier Attack, I suppose. However, Penetrator does have a surprise up its sleeve in the form of landscape customization, where you can even save your customized landscapes. Very ahead of its time, I'd say. There is also a training mode which gives you the option to play any of the game's first 4 stages with unlimited lives. So if you're a fan of Scrabble and its clones, Penetrator is a brilliant choice for offering a bit more than your traditional clones. The game that became one of Quicksilver's most celebrated games, as well as one of the most famous early Spectrum games in general, is Sandy White's 3D maze game, Ant Attack. If you happen to be deathly afraid of ants, this game could also be considered something of an early horror survival game. As if that wasn't enough trailblazing for one game, Ant Attack was also one of the first games to give you the option to play as a girl or a boy. Your mission is to find and rescue 10 stranded members of the opposite sex from around the ant-infested area while fending the ants off with throwable grenades. Each of the rescuees needs to be escorted back to the area where you start your rescue operation from, so you really need to learn your way around the map and dispose of as many ants as possible prior to the escorting part of the game. I didn't really get to play Ant Attack before emulation came along, but it was one of the first games I ever tried out when it became a possibility, which is over 25 years ago already. It took me a while to really understand the appeal of the game, but it has become one of my favorite games from 1983, and it's a game I like to revisit often enough. DK-Tronics is a publishing company that is not particularly well known outside of the Spectrum community, but they made a few rather nice games in the 1982-1984 period, their best known game likely being the maze game Maziacs. Although it plays rather crudely, Maziacs is a surprisingly complex game for what it is. Your goal is to fetch a treasure from deep within each maze, and then bring it back to where you started. On your way you will come across human-sized spider-like monsters called Maziacs that will more likely kill you if you're not carrying a sword. Prisoners tied to walls can guide you towards the treasure and back again, and depleted energy can be restored by eating food items. To me, the most charming thing about Maziacs has always been the fighting animations, but the crudely basic style of the game does give it a certain claustrophobic feel that wouldn't necessarily be there if it scrolled smoother. As such, the game plays almost exactly the same on all the platforms it was ever ported on, but I have only ever really played it extensively on the ZX Spectrum, so that's where my nostalgia for it is. Just to get one game into this episode that I have written a comparison of for the blog, I decided to include Chuckie Egg, a classic single-screen platformer from 1983 that could be argued is better than Manic Miner, which I have seen some do. Well, I wouldn't be too sure about that, but Chuckie Egg definitely has its own thing going on, which works brilliantly. On the surface, it's as much collecting things and avoiding enemies as Manic Miner or any other old-school single-screen platformer, but the jump mechanics, fall distance allowances, and the ladders and lifts make Chuckie Egg much more instantly playable than Manic Miner. Having said that, there isn't quite as much content in Chuckie Egg as one would wish. Compared to Manic Miner's 20 quite difficult levels, Chuckie Egg can only boast of having 8 rather easy to master ones, although the difficulty level rises slightly after each completion of the loop. Be that as it may, Chuckie Egg has earned its spot as one of the most classic Spectrum games of all time, and should be experienced by every self-respecting retro gamer. This next one is a game I have tried to play many times, but for some reason never really got into it properly. One of the most revered text adventures from the early days of Spectrum gaming is, of course, The Hobbit, from Melbourne House 1982. I even bought it into my Spectrum collection a while ago, just because I feel it's some sort of a status item for collectors, despite it being quite common. I suppose one of the reasons why I never really managed to get drawn into the game was that I was never that big a fan of Tolkien's work. The Lord of the Rings trilogy I have read and seen the movies, but The Hobbit just never clicked with me in any way, and I've never finished the book, the movies, or the 1982 adventure game. Not for the lack of trying, though. The nostalgia I have for this game has more to do with reading a walkthrough of the game many times in wonder before even laying my eyes on the game itself. Then, when I did eventually get to play the game for the first time, circa 1986, I had problems keeping up with the walkthrough. The thing is, the game moves the non-playable characters around in a timed, yet somewhat random fashion, and since you need to interact with certain characters at certain times in certain places, it does get more than a bit annoying, particularly when you get suddenly attacked by an ogre or something. Maybe I haven't given this game enough of a chance, but text adventures rarely work as well as they should. Our 20th and final game for today is another board game, which, for once, I actually played quite a lot as a board game, although it was a localized version of it. The game in question is Scrabble. Yes, it's another Sinclair Research release of a Scion game. Didn't expect that one, did you? Well, the reason for including this one here is because Scion's Computer Scrabble is the first computerized version of the game, and more importantly, the first English version of the game I have ever played. And I did play it a few times around the turn of the millennium before an online version of Scrabble appeared, and that one took over as the Scrabble of choice for a few years. The Scion Scrabble was playable enough, although it did suffer from a relative lack of vocabulary. To my younger self, what was brilliant about it was that you could play it by yourself to practice thinking of words with the given letters to eventually play a more proper online version of Scrabble in English. But it shall always be my first computer Scrabble, which is why I bought it into my collection a few years ago.